Wait,
You know
what was
that
that
moment
tone?
when
You
something
think you can talk
small
to me like
happens?
that?
Maybe a
I'll
comment, a
talk to you however I
tone, or the
want.
way
Who
someone
are you
responds to
anyway?
you, and instead of reacting, instead of explaining how you feel, you just go quiet? Not dramatic, not obvious, just a subtle withdrawal. Most people see that and assume you don't care, like you've checked out emotionally. But what's actually happening in that moment is something much deeper, and honestly, much more complex than it looks on the surface. For a long time, it's easy to believe that this kind of silence means something is wrong, like maybe you're avoiding confrontation, or maybe you're not expressive enough. But when you start looking into the psychology behind it, a different picture begins to form. Going quiet when you're hurt isn't random. It's not a flaw. It's a pattern your mind has learned over time, and it usually begins in a way so subtle you don't even notice it happening. Here's what makes this fascinating. When something hurts you, your brain doesn't just react emotionally. It also starts evaluating the situation almost instantly. It asks questions in the background like, is it safe to respond right now? Or will explaining this actually help? Or even, is this worth the energy it will take? And the interesting part is, you're not always aware this is happening. It's quiet, automatic, almost like your mind is protecting you before you even fully understand what you're feeling. So instead of reacting, instead of speaking up immediately, you pause. And from the outside, that pause can look like disconnection, but internally, it's the opposite. It's not emptiness, it's overload. Your mind is trying to process what just happened while also managing how you feel about it, and that takes more energy than people realize. Think about it like this. Your mind has a limited amount of emotional energy at any given time. Every interaction, every expectation, every small disappointment, it all adds up. So when something hurts you, especially if it's unexpected or confusing, your brain is already busy trying to make sense of it. Now add the pressure of responding, explaining yourself, or navigating someone else's reaction on top of that, and suddenly it becomes overwhelming. And here's the part most people overlook. When your brain feels overwhelmed, it doesn't always react loudly. It doesn't always lead to arguments or emotional outbursts. Sometimes the most efficient thing it can do is reduce input, to pull back, to go quiet. Not because you don't care, but because you're trying to manage too much at once. Now this is where things start to get psychologically interesting. This response isn't just about what's happening in the moment. It's also shaped by your past experiences. If there have been times when you spoke up and weren't understood, or moments where your feelings were dismissed or minimized, your brain remembers that. Not necessarily as a clear memory, but as a pattern. So the next time something hurts, your mind doesn't just evaluate the present situation. It references everything that came before it. It quietly asks, what usually happens when I express this? And if the answer feels uncertain or negative, silence becomes the safer option. Not the easier one, just the safer one. Don't get it twisted, though. This doesn't mean you don't want to communicate. It doesn't mean you don't care enough to explain how you feel. In fact, it often means the opposite. It means you care so much that you're trying to avoid making things worse. You're trying to avoid conflict, misunderstanding, or saying something you might regret in a moment of emotional intensity. Here's something that might feel a bit counterintuitive. People who go quiet when they're hurt are often the ones who feel things very deeply. They notice small changes in tone, subtle shifts in behavior, things that other people might completely overlook. And because of that, when something feels off, it doesn't just pass through them. It stays, it expands. It becomes something they need to process internally before they can even think about expressing it outwardly. And this is where silence takes on a completely different meaning. It's not avoidance, it's processing. Your mind is trying to understand not just what happened, but why it affected you the way it did. It's sorting through layers of emotion, context, and memory all at the same time. And that kind of processing doesn't happen instantly. Now here's the part that really flips the script. Silence, in this context, can actually be a form of control. When emotions are high, a lot of people react impulsively. They say things they don't mean. They escalate situations without realizing it. But when you go quiet, you're doing something different. You're creating space between what you feel and how you respond. Psychologists refer to this as emotional self-regulation. It's the ability to experience your emotions without immediately acting on them. And while it might look like withdrawal from the outside, internally, it's a form of discipline. You're holding yourself steady in a moment that could easily become chaotic. If this feels familiar to you, it might be worth exploring more patterns like this. Sometimes just understanding the why behind your behavior can change the way you see yourself. And if you find yourself connecting with this, subscribing simply helps this kind of perspective reach more people who might quietly relate but don't always have the words for it. Now, there's something important that doesn't get talked about enough. There's a difference between choosing silence and feeling stuck in silence. Choosing silence feels calm. It feels intentional, like you're giving yourself space to think and process. But feeling stuck in silence, that's different. That's when you have things you want to say, but something inside you holds you back. Maybe it's the fear of being misunderstood. Maybe it's the thought that speaking up won't actually change anything. Or maybe it's just emotional exhaustion, that feeling of not having the energy to explain yourself again. And over time, that kind of silence can start to build, not in a loud, obvious way, but in small, almost invisible shifts. You might notice yourself becoming a little more distant, a little more guarded, not because you don't care, but because caring has started to feel heavier than it used to. And this is where things become even more interesting, because your brain is always trying to maintain some form of emotional balance. If expressing your feelings has consistently led to more stress, more conflict, or more frustration, your mind adapts. It looks for a lower risk strategy. And often that strategy is quiet withdrawal. Again, not because you're weak, but because you're efficient. You're minimizing emotional cost in a way that feels manageable. But like most coping patterns, there's a trade-off. Because when things remain unspoken, they don't just disappear. They stay in the background. They influence your mood, your energy, your willingness to connect. And this is where awareness becomes powerful, not forcing yourself to suddenly change or become more expressive overnight, but simply noticing the pattern as it happens, noticing when you go quiet, noticing what triggered it, noticing what you were feeling underneath it all. Because once you start seeing it clearly, something shifts. You realize your silence isn't random, it's meaningful. It's your mind trying to handle something complex in the best way it knows how. And that realization alone can bring a sense of relief, not because everything is solved, but because it finally makes sense. So if you've ever gone quiet when you were hurt, it doesn't automatically mean you're bad at communication. It might mean you've learned to process things deeply, to protect your energy, to avoid unnecessary conflict. And in many ways, that reflects a kind of awareness that not everyone has. At the same time, it's worth gently asking yourself one question. Does your silence help you process and heal, or does it leave things unresolved? Because those are two very different experiences, and understanding that difference can quietly change the way you relate to yourself. Because in the end, this isn't really about silence. It's about understanding the patterns behind it. It's about recognizing that your reactions have meaning, even when they don't look the way others expect them to. And sometimes that understanding alone can shift something inside you. And once you start noticing it, you begin to see it everywhere. In your own behavior, in the way others respond, in those quiet moments that used to feel confusing. And slowly, silence stops being something you question and becomes something you understand. If this gave you a new way to see yourself, you can stay connected for more reflections like this. Sometimes the smallest insights are the ones that stay with you the longest.